Ladies and gentlemen, there is a moment in every toxic dynamic when something shifts so quietly that only one person feels it, you. It's the moment you stop doubting yourself, the moment the truth settles in, and the moment the other person realizes you can no longer be controlled. This is not the story of anger or revenge. This is the story of what happens when a narcissist knows they're guilty, and what that realization does to their behavior, their power, and their fear. If you've ever felt the confusion, the silence, the sudden coldness after clarity, stay with me. What you're about to hear may finally explain everything. Guilt threatens a narcissist's identity because their sense of self is not built on accountability, but on image. For most people, guilt is uncomfortable yet useful. It signals misalignment between values and behavior and invites reflection. For a narcissist, guilt does something far more dangerous. It doesn't simply point to a mistake. It exposes a crack in the identity they depend on to survive. A narcissist does not experience themselves as a whole, stable person who can be flawed and still worthy. Their identity is constructed like a fragile performance, held together by admiration, control, and the belief that they are superior, justified, or untouchable. When guilt appears, it threatens to dismantle that entire structure. Admitting wrongdoing would mean admitting vulnerability, limitation, or imperfection, and to a narcissist, that feels like annihilation. This is why guilt does not lead them to remorse. Remorse requires a secure sense of self, one strong enough to say, "I was wrong, and I am still okay." A narcissist lacks that internal safety. Guilt feels less like a moral signal and more like an existential threat. It tells them, "You are not who you claim to be," and that message is intolerable. So instead of integrating guilt, they externalize it. They project blame, distort reality, or attack the source of exposure. The goal is not to resolve the harm, but to protect the identity at all costs. This is why they fight accountability with such intensity. They are not defending a behavior. They are defending themselves from collapse. Understanding this is crucial because it explains why logic, evidence, or emotional appeals rarely work. You are not negotiating about actions, you are confronting a survival mechanism. And when identity is on the line, self-preservation will always overpower conscience. And once their identity feels threatened, once that inner image begins to crack, the next move is almost instinctive. They shift. What once looked like charm, warmth, or confidence hardens into control. This is the second phase most people don't recognize until they're already inside it. At first, the narcissist's charm felt effortless. It made you feel chosen, understood, even safe. But charm was never intimacy, it was leverage. It was the way they secured admiration and influence without revealing anything real. So when guilt exposes them, when they sense that admiration slipping, they cannot rely on charm anymore. It no longer works on someone who sees clearly. Control replaces it. Their tone changes. Conversations become interrogations. Your words are twisted. Your intentions questioned. They may suddenly need to clarify everything you say, not to understand you, but to dominate the narrative. The goal is simple: regain psychological ground. If they can control the story, they can avoid facing the truth. You might notice subtle power plays, withholding affection, creating confusion, moving the goalpost so you're always explaining, always justifying, always slightly off balance. This is not accidental. Control is how they reestablish superiority when their image is threatened. And here's the painful part. They don't escalate because you did something wrong. They escalate because you stopped feeding the illusion. Your awareness destabilized the dynamic, and control is their emergency response. This is why you may feel a sudden emotional coldness where warmth once lived, or an intensity that feels invasive rather than caring. It's not passion, it's surveillance. They are watching for signs they still matter, still dominate, still own the emotional space. Understanding this shift frees you from self-blame. The moment charm turns into control is not a failure on your part. It is evidence that you are no longer playing the role they needed you to play. And once you see that, their grip weakens, because control only works on someone who believes they need permission to stand in their truth. And when control alone no longer restores their sense of power, when your clarity keeps slipping through their fingers, they reach for something sharper. Denial becomes their shield, and projection becomes their weapon. This is the phase where reality itself is no longer safe. At this point, the narcissist is not trying to solve anything. They are trying to survive exposure. Admitting the truth would mean admitting guilt, and guilt still threatens the fragile identity they are protecting. So instead of facing what they've done, they reject the premise entirely. What you experienced is minimized, dismissed, or erased. Events are reworded, timelines altered, intentions rewritten. Not subtly, confidently. They speak with certainty because certainty confuses people. When someone denies your lived experience with absolute conviction, it creates disorientation. You start replaying moments, questioning your memory, wondering if you misunderstood something obvious. That confusion is the purpose. If they can destabilize your trust in yourself, they regain control without having to change. And then comes projection. The very behaviors they refuse to own are suddenly placed on you. You're accused of being manipulative, dramatic, selfish, or cruel, often using the same language you once used to describe their actions. This isn't coincidence. It's psychological displacement. They are exporting their guilt into your identity so they don't have to feel it. What makes this especially painful is how personal it feels. They don't attack randomly. They target your values, your sensitivity, your intentions. They aim where you care most, because that's where doubt will hurt the deepest. The more you try to explain, the more material they have to twist. This is where many people lose themselves, not because they are weak, but because they are honest. They assume truth will eventually matter. But with a narcissist, denial and projection are not temporary defenses. They are permanent strategies. The moment you recognize this, something shifts. You stop arguing with a distorted mirror. You stop chasing validation from someone invested in misunderstanding you. And in that quiet refusal to engage, you begin to reclaim the ground they could only occupy as long as you questioned your own reality. And when denial no longer confuses you, when projection no longer lands the way it once did, they move again. This time, not to explain, not to dominate the story, but to disappear from it emotionally. Silence, rage, or sudden victimhood take the place of accountability, because facing you now would mean facing themselves. Silence is often the first choice. Conversations end mid-sentence. Messages go unanswered. Emotional warmth evaporates. This is not space for reflection. It is a calculated withdrawal. The goal is to make you uncomfortable enough to chase, to fill, void they created, to abandon your clarity just to restore connection. Silence becomes a test of how much of yourself you are willing to give up to be seen again. If silence fails, rage may follow, not always loud, not always explosive, but sharp and destabilizing. Anger creates chaos, and chaos shifts attention away from truth. In the presence of rage, the original issue gets lost. Suddenly, you're defending your tone, your reaction, your character. Accountability dissolves in the noise, and when even rage no longer works, they reach for victimhood. They present themselves as misunderstood, attacked, wounded by your accusations. The narrative flips. Your boundaries become cruelty. Your honesty becomes betrayal. They speak of how much they've suffered, how unfairly they've been treated, as if your request for responsibility was an act of violence. What all of these responses share is the same core intention: to avoid responsibility while keeping emotional power. Accountability requires humility, and humility would collapse the identity they are protecting. So instead, they punish truth by withdrawing connection or flooding the space with emotion. This is where the deepest lesson emerges. Their silence, their anger, their tears are not proof that you went too far. They are proof that you reached the place they cannot follow. When you stop reacting to these tactics, you step out of the cycle entirely. And in that stillness, you begin to understand something vital. Their refusal to take responsibility was never about your worth. It was about their fear of facing themselves. And once they can no longer silence you, intimidate you, or reposition themselves as the wounded party, they attempt something even more unsettling. They rewrite the past. Not partially, completely. Because if they can change the story, they can escape the shame. History, to a narcissist, is not a record. It is a tool. When guilt threatens them, memory becomes flexible. What was once said was taken out of context. What was once promised was never meant that way. Harm becomes misunderstanding. Cruelty becomes concern. Betrayal becomes necessity. And slowly, the version of events you live through is replaced with a narrative that protects them. This is not forgetfulness. it is survival. They retell the story so often with such confidence that it begins to sound believable, even to them. And if you challenge it, you're accused of holding grudges, being stuck in the past, or refusing to move on. But moving on, in their language, means agreeing to their version of reality. What makes this especially painful is that you remember the truth clearly. You remember how it felt in your body. The confusion, the broken trust, the moments you went quiet just to keep the peace, and yet you're told it didn't happen that way or didn't happen at all. This is where many people feel the deepest fracture inside themselves, not because of what was done, but because their reality is being erased. When someone rewrites history, they are not just avoiding guilt, they are asking you to abandon your own memory to protect their ego. And here is the quiet strength you begin to develop. You stop trying to correct the story. You realize that truth does not need their agreement to exist. You no longer argue for facts with someone invested in fiction. The moment you trust your memory, again, the rewriting loses its power. Because no matter how many versions they create, they cannot undo one thing. You were there, you know what you lived. And choosing to honor that truth is how you begin to step out of their story and back into your own. And when their rewritten story no longer convinces you, when you stop correcting the record and simply stand firm in what you know, something inside them shifts again. Your clarity becomes the very thing that unsettles them most. Not your anger, not your explanations, your certainty. A narcissist can work with confusion. They can exploit doubt. They can manipulate emotional reactions, but clarity leaves them with nowhere to go. It doesn't argue. It doesn't plead. It doesn't need permission. It simply exists. And that quiet certainty exposes everything they've tried to hide. This is why your calm understanding feels threatening to them. You're no longer asking, "Did I imagine this?" You're no longer seeking validation for what you lived. You're no longer trying to convince them of your reality. And without that engagement, their power weakens. Control depends on reaction, and clarity starves it. They sense this shift immediately. You speak less, but with more weight. You respond without emotional charge. You set boundaries without justification. And suddenly, the dynamic they relied on feels unstable. Because clarity signals independence, and independence means they are no longer the authority over your truth. This is the moment they often escalate in subtler ways. They may provoke, bait, or test you, hoping to pull you back into emotional engagement. Not because they want connection, but because they want proof they still matter. Your clarity threatens the core belief that they define the emotional landscape. What they fear is not losing you, it's losing influence over you. And here's the quiet transformation happening inside you. You begin to trust yourself more than their reactions. You no longer measure your reality against their approval. You understand that clarity doesn't need consensus. This is why your grounded presence feels like rejection to them. Not because you've attacked them, but because you've withdrawn your confusion. And without confusion, manipulation cannot survive. Clarity is not loud. It does not need to prove itself. But in the presence of someone who built their power on distortion, it becomes unmistakably disruptive. And once you step into it fully, you realize something freeing. You don't need them to see the truth for it to be real. And when your clarity no longer wavers, when it stays steady no matter how they test it, they respond in one of the only ways they know how. They punish the truth. Not openly, not always dramatically, but precisely. Because they cannot argue with your awareness, they try to make I cost you something. Affection becomes conditional. Warmth turns selective. The connection you once felt is withheld like a resource you no longer deserve. This is not distance born of reflection. It is a consequence designed to teach you a lesson. The unspoken message is clear. If you want peace, comfort, or closeness, you must abandon what you know. Sometimes the punishment comes as chaos, sudden crises, manufactured conflicts, emotional whiplash that pulls your attention away from the truth and back into survival mode. When life feels unstable, clarity becomes harder to maintain, and that instability is intentional. They may become unpredictable, inconsistent, or strangely indifferent at moments that once mattered deeply. This emotional unpredictability is meant to destabilize you, to make you question whether standing in your truth was worth the loss. Because if truth hurts enough, you might retreat from it. What's important to understand is this: the punishment is not about correction, it's about control. They are attempting to train you emotionally to associate honesty with loss and compliance with relief. But something different begins to happen when you no longer react the way they expect. You stop scrambling to restore what was withheld. You stop internalizing the withdrawal as a reflection of your worth. You see the pattern for what it is, and in that moment, the punishment loses its power. Because when you no longer trade your truth for temporary peace, their leverage disappears. They can withhold affection, but they cannot take your self-respect. They can create chaos, but they cannot erase your awareness. This is where strength quietly replaces fear. You realize that losing false connection is not loss at all. It is the price of freedom. And once you accept that, the punishment becomes proof that you are no longer controllable, only unattainable. On their terms. And this is where many people still hope for a turning point that never comes. They believe that if the narcissist truly understands the harm, guilt will finally soften them, that remorse will arrive, that something human will break through. But guilt does not melt a narcissist's defenses. It hardens them. By now, guilt has become a constant threat in the background. Not something they feel and process, but something they must keep contained. So instead of opening up, they fortify. They become more rigid, more strategic, more emotionally armored. The walls go up higher because vulnerability now feels too dangerous. You may notice them becoming colder, more distant, more controlled in their responses. Or paradoxically, more polished, more performative, as if they are perfecting the role again. This is not healing. This is reinforcement. They are doubling down on the very traits that allowed them to avoid accountability in the first place. The reason is simple but painful. Softness would require self-reflection, and self-reflection would force them to face the guilt they've been running from. So they choose defense over growth, control over connection, image over intimacy. This is why conversations begin to feel transactional instead of emotional, why empathy feels rehearsed, why any admission of fault is shallow and quickly redirected. Guilt doesn't open them, it convinces them they must protect themselves even more aggressively. And here's the crucial realization for you: this hardening is not your failure. It is not because you asked for too much, explained poorly, or lacked compassion. It is because guilt, in someone without a stable sense of self, feels unbearable. What changes now is not them, it's you. You stop waiting for softness from someone who survives by staying defended. You stop interpreting their emotional armor as strength. You see it for what it is: fear dressed as control. And with that understanding, something loosens inside you. You no longer hope for a breakthrough that requires them to become someone they are unwilling to be. You begin to grieve the fantasy, and in doing so, you step closer to freedom. And as that fantasy dissolves, as you stop waiting for them to soften or change, something unexpected becomes clear. Their reactions were never random. They were signals, proof that something fundamental had shifted, not in them, but in you. Your awakening is what triggered everything. The defensiveness, the rewriting of history, the punishment, the emotional hardening, none of it began when you became cruel or demanding. It began when you became aware, when you stopped absorbing blame that didn't belong to you, when you stopped bending reality to preserve the connection, when you started seeing patterns instead of excuses. That awareness disrupted the role you were meant to play. You were supposed to doubt yourself, to explain yourself, to keep hoping, to keep carrying the emotional weight so they wouldn't have to. The moment you stepped out of that role, the system failed. And what followed was not coincidence, it was resistance. This is why their behavior intensified as you grew clearer, why things felt worse after you understood more. Growth destabilizes dynamics built on imbalance. Your awakening threatened the structure they relied on to feel powerful, superior, or safe. And here is the most important shift. You stop personalizing their reaction. You stop asking, why are they doing this to me? And start recognizing this is happening because I no longer fit. Their anger, their withdrawal, their coldness, these are not reflections of your worth. They are evidence that you changed the rules by refusing to play unconsciously. This realization can feel both painful and empowering. Painful because it confirms that the connection was conditional. Empowering because it means you are no longer trapped inside it. You didn't break the relationship by waking up. You exposed what it required from you. And once you see that, you stop chasing explanations. You stop defending your growth. You understand that awakening is disruptive by nature, not because it harms others, but because it removes their ability to hide behind your confusion. What they reacted to was not your anger, your words, or your boundaries. They reacted to your clarity. And that reaction is proof that you crossed a threshold they could never control again. And once you understand that their reactions were responses to your awakening, not evidence of your failure, the final truth settles in quietly, but firmly. You realize that the consequence they feared most was never confrontation, exposure, or even loss. It was losing access to you. Not your presence, but your availability. Not your body, but your emotional energy. Not your words, but your willingness to engage. Because while they could deny, project, punish, and harden themselves, there was one thing they could never control: your inner peace. And once you stopped handing that over, the dynamic ended, whether they acknowledged it or not. Your peace becomes the boundary they cannot argue with. It doesn't debate. It doesn't explain. It simply exists beyond their reach. And that is what stays with them far longer than any argument ever could. They may tell themselves stories about why you changed. They may frame your distance as cruelty or coldness. But deep down, they know. They know something shifted and cannot be reversed. You no longer orbit their moods. You no longer seek their validation. You no longer react on command. And that loss is permanent. Not because you punish them, but because you chose yourself. This is the consequence no narcissist can escape. The quiet knowing that someone saw them clearly and still walked away whole. Not angry, not broken, just finished. And here is where your story completes its arc. You don't leave with vengeance, you leave with clarity. You don't win by proving them wrong. You win by refusing to live in distortion. Peace is not passive, it is earned. It comes from choosing truth over familiarity, self-respect over attachment, and awareness over illusion. And when you carry that peace forward, it does something powerful. It restores your sense of self. It reconnects you to your intuition. It reminds you that love should never require the erasure of your reality. So if you ever wonder what they do when they know they're guilty, remember this: they fight to keep control. But when you choose peace, control no longer has a place to land. And that is how the story ends. And if you've stayed until this moment, it's because something in this story touched a truth you already felt, but maybe never had words for. Because deep down, you didn't come here to understand them. You came here to understand yourself, to make sense of the confusion, the exhaustion, the quiet feeling that something was always off, even when you tried your hardest to make it work. Let this be the moment you stop questioning your clarity. Let this be the moment you recognize that awareness was never the problem. It was the beginning of your freedom. What you experienced was real. What you felt mattered. And the strength it took to see through illusion, to stand still while someone tried to rewrite your reality, is not weakness. It is courage. You do. It need their admission of guilt to move forward. You don't need closure from someone who survives by avoiding truth. Closure comes from understanding the pattern and choosing not to repeat it. It comes from trusting yourself again, from honoring the part of you that refused to disappear just to keep the peace. And here's the quiet promise I want you to carry with you. Peace will feel unfamiliar at first. It won't be dramatic. It won't beg for attention, but it will feel steady, safe, yours. And that steadiness is how you'll know you're healing. If this message resonated, stay with it, sit with it, let it reshape how you see past interactions and future boundaries. Because the more you understand these dynamics, the less power they hold over you. You didn't lose anything by waking up. You gained yourself. And as you move forward, remember this: the moment you choose truth over illusion, no one who depended on your confusion can follow you there. Stay grounded, stay aware, and above all, stay connected to the version of you that finally chose peace.